Welcome to the Bluffton Biblecast. The fear of the Lord is the beginning of wisdom, and the righteous shall live by faith. But what does a life of faith look like? Join us as we meditate on the wisdom literature of ancient Israel and the teaching of the apostles of Jesus Christ. My name is Steve Ringer, and I am here today with Sean Lehman and Javon Steffen, with Lisa Lehman as our sound engineer. This week, we are exploring 2 Corinthians 8 through 13, where Paul shares principles about generosity and giving and openly exposes his heart as he defends his apostolic authority to the believers at Corinth.
Our reading this week picks up where we left off at chapter 8 in 2 Corinthians. In chapters 8 and 9, Paul is asking the Corinthians for a financial donation. He's gathering a collection from all the Greek churches for the Christians in Jerusalem.
So why was Paul collecting money for the Jerusalem Christians?
So, apparently, the Christian community in Jerusalem was struggling with intense poverty. In studying for these chapters, I read that there was both famine and persecution that they were facing.
I can easily believe that they would face persecution. They were living amongst the same people that called for Jesus to be executed.
That's right, Javon. And even though the Bible records that many Jews came to believe in Jesus after his death, it was still the Pharisees and Sadducees that ruled the Jewish people, and I'm sure they did not take very kindly to Christians.
Right, yeah. Anyways, so Paul was going around taking up a collection to support the poor. And in verse 10 of chapter 8, he alludes to the Corinthian church being eager to support this very initiative a year prior, but had not yet done so. In David Guzik's commentary, he suggests that perhaps the reason they had not done so yet could be due to the breakdown in the relationship that the Corinthians had with Paul that we were talking about last week.
When reading these chapters, I took note of how he compared the Corinthian church to the Macedonian churches, who have already given to the collection, even though they were not nearly as well off as the Corinthian church.
Yeah, Paul was using their generosity as an example of cheerful giving and encouraging the Corinthians to also do so. But he's also careful to state that he's not demanding contribution, but asking for a free will donation of whatever amount they felt led to donate.
In verse 9 of chapter 8, Paul gives a basis for why charitable giving should be characteristic of a Christian. Because Christ, while he was rich, chose to become poor by coming down to earth as an incarnate man, so that we who are poor, being lost in sin, can become rich through salvation.
It's almost like Paul is saying, hey guys, I know we've had our disagreements, but this isn't about you and me. It's about our Jewish brothers who have had a very real need and about having Christ's love in our hearts.
Yeah, I kind of get that same vibe when reading through these chapters. Perhaps that's also why Paul sent Titus to receive the collection and not himself, to remove any obstacle he could to cheerful giving, if perhaps there were still some who are struggling with their view of Paul.
You know, it's reassuring to me that even in Paul's day, things got sticky when it came to dealing with money and asking for charity.
I guess that's why Jesus told us that it's impossible to serve God and mammon.
Yeah, and also, where your treasure is, there will your heart be also.
Good stuff. The possible theme for this week's reading could be Paul shares his heart. And this is clearly demonstrated by the intensity of Paul's appeal to the Corinthians in this letter called 2 Corinthians.
Why do you think Paul spent so much time defending his apostolic credentials and actions?
I don't think Paul was so much concerned about his personal feelings or reputation, but by defending his apostleship, he was also defending the integrity of the gospel of which he preached. He wanted to maintain the purity of that gospel message to protect the Corinthians from being led astray by false teachers and away from the simplicity in Christ.
Yeah, his actions and words really did show his love for this church.
The fact that Paul spent so much time and effort in challenging the Corinthian church demonstrates the high level of concern he had about their spiritual welfare, didn't it?
Absolutely, Javon. I don't think the Corinthians were aware that they were in such danger of reverting to another gospel, which really wasn't a gospel at all. As Paul states in the early part of chapter 11, the Corinthian church was dangerously close to repeating the error of Eve in the garden by falling for Satan's lure to disobey.
So, who were these false teachers?
Well, we're not exactly sure, but it's safe to say they were messengers representing Satan much more than Christ. Paul states in chapter 11 that Satan often disguises himself as an angel of light, and so why wouldn't his representatives?
How could they even get leverage, as Paul was such a powerful apostle and teacher? Like, what did these false teachers or super apostles use to undermine the trust in Paul's leadership?
Good question. Unfortunately, with the fickleness of the human heart, it doesn't take much to plant seeds of doubt with respect to our leaders. Look at the serpent in the Garden of Eden, where he starts out with a simple question using the phrase, "Yea, hath God said?" Then it all went downhill from there. The false teachers used Paul's change in travel plans to suggest that he was a vacillator or unreliable. They also looked at his humility and meekness and represented them as weakness.
Yeah, and the fact that Paul suffered, which we will hear more about later in this podcast, was cause for them to suggest he was not blessed by God either.
I think the Corinthians' tendency to so quickly look at physical and worldly attributes rather than the spiritual is why Paul went into a dissertation on contrasting worldly and heavenly weapons in chapter 10. He stated the weapons he used were not carnal, but spiritual, suited for spiritual warfare.
So the worldly weapons could be such things as eloquence, intimidation, manipulation, deceit, self-promotion, and such things, while heavenly weapons would consist of things such as faith, truth, gentleness, humility, meekness, etc., and all encompassed by prayer and under the authority of the Word.
That's a great summary, Sean. Did you notice how Paul had to stoop down to the level of the Corinthian church to help them see the difference between him and the false teachers?
Yeah, he seemed a little uncomfortable doing so, but must have felt it was his only viable option to get them to see the futility of measuring themselves and comparing themselves with others.
For sure, Javon. He reverts to what he called the folly of boasting, and then highlights his credentials and accomplishments versus those of the false teachers. Listeners, as you read the last part of 2 Corinthians, you'll see a huge contrast between the false teachers and the Apostle Paul. The heavenly weapons of the Apostle Paul may appear weak in the eyes of the world, but in reality, they have the power to destroy strongholds and take into captivity every thought to the obedience of Christ.
When was the last time you wrote a letter to someone, Sean?
Oh, it's been a few years. Why?
Well, we're nearing the end of Paul's last letter to the Corinthians, and I've been thinking about the heart of Paul. When you wrote your letter, I bet you cared deeply for the recipient, right?
Oh, yeah, for sure. It was Kara. The letter I'm thinking of was to Kara at a difficult time in our marriage. Writing a letter allowed me to say some things that I needed to say and allowed her to consider them, all without the danger of saying something in the heat of the moment that we may later regret.
Thanks for sharing. Letters tend to feel personal and always speak from the heart. They are a deeper way of connecting about the good, the bad, and the hard. Steve, do you think that would change the personal aspect of the letter, since this letter was written to a group of people?
Maybe. But as I've read these chapters, I think it allows us to see the variety of perspectives Paul intentionally addresses as he shares his stories, trials, and concerns.
So that makes sense why he seems to cover his past sufferings, weaknesses, and concerns about false apostles a few times. He's connecting to lots of people. Paul also explains the trials had improved his walk with Christ.
Yeah, when we are weak, he is strong, right?
Right. Paul suffered just as Christ himself suffered during his life on earth.
Wasn't that quite a list of harrowing experiences?
I can remember a few: being put in prison, whipped, facing death.
Yeah, there were 5 different times the Jewish leaders whipped him. 3 times he was beaten with rods, and I think he was even stoned.
And let's not forget he was also shipwrecked, spent 24 hours lost at sea, went through many long journeys in the care of the churches.
He faced danger so many times, from rivers, robbers, his own people, the Jews, the Gentiles, and cities and deserts on the sea, from men who claimed to be believers. And he had times of being hungry and thirsty in the cold without enough clothes.
Quite the resume of suffering, if you ask me. It seems no matter what hard times the Corinthians had been through, Paul could relate.
So, Steve and Sean, how would you have received this letter?
Well, he mentioned false apostles, so I'd be wondering which of the leaders around me I need to be watching out for.
Good point. Paul's letter encouraged discernment. Anything else?
I don't know. He defended himself a lot. It kind of feels a little repetitive to me.
Sure, I could see that. I think he tried to connect with such a wide variety of perspectives and share everything he could while he could. Letters had to be a bit more comprehensive than a current-day email or text message, considering how much time they took to arrive, didn't they?
Yeah, that's true.
He mentioned that suffering and various trials drew him closer to God, so we could also learn from his example, not to avoid conflict and not shy away from being bold for the gospel.
Yeah, when he mentioned the thorn in the flesh in chapter 12, we don't know exactly what that is, but the point was how we respond to suffering, especially the kind that might not end.
And what about his vision in chapter 12?
He said he was caught up to the third heaven 14 years ago, and he heard things so astounding they cannot be expressed in words. It's not something that even Paul fully understood. Quote, whether I was in my body or out of my body, I don't know. Only God knows. Unquote. We do know Paul is sharing a very personal moment with God, though, and connecting with the Corinthian people on a deeper level.
This week, we'll wrap up 5 weeks of study of Paul's letters to the Corinthian church. Paul's covered a lot of ground in these 2 letters: admonishment, encouragement, instruction. But all the different parts shared one commonality. Paul's reasoning in all of it always came back to because Jesus. Well, listeners, I posed Javon's same question to you. How would you receive Paul's letter if it had been written to you? Or flip the script around. How would you reach out to a person or a group of people who you saw going down the wrong path? However those answers may be, if our reasoning is always because Jesus, I think good things will follow. On behalf of Steve, Javon, Lisa, and myself, thanks for listening and have a blessed week.